Welcome to the Veriff Voices podcast, a collection of conversations with leaders from across the industry, sharing tips and valuable insight into shaping the future of online identity. This podcast is brought to you by the people of Veriff, rebuilding trust in the digital world.
Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Veriff Voices, the podcast where we talk about tech, fraud, compliance, and all things related to identity verification. Joining me today to do so is our special guest, Zain Homsi, who is an AI product manager at LinkedIn. Now, we'll get to Zain in a moment to say welcome properly, but just to let you know, today's topic is around generative AI, all aspects of it, and specifically how it relates to fraud and the products that we're seeing in the market at the moment. And please note as well that the views expressed today are the personal views of Zain and not of the organisation LinkedIn. Zain, over to you. Thank you very much for joining us. Could you just give us a little bit of an intro? Maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, where you're from, and maybe a little bit about your current role as well.
Thank you, Chris, for having me on the podcast, and hello to all the Veriff fans and listeners tuning in. My name is Zain Homsi. As Chris mentioned, I'm currently an AI product manager at LinkedIn, and I've been with LinkedIn for coming up on 5 years in just a few months, which it's crazy how quickly that time has flown by. But I've had the privilege to do a number of things in my time at LinkedIn. I've gotten to touch a number of our business lines, from our software as a service businesses to our media business to bits of our consumer business. I've got an affinity for platform technologies and sort of all of the magic that has to happen behind the scenes for a technology company to come to life. And so have worked in business operations, have worked as a chief of staff before, and really now I'm at a point where my team is focused on building artificial intelligence applications for LinkedIn's go-to-market motion. So think about AI for salespeople, AI for customer support, AI for really any of the customer touch points that any technology company or enterprise company might interact with. Personally, I'm a huge scuba diver, and that's probably where I spend most of my free time. So if you end up catching up with me at some other point, you'll probably mention or show you a picture of a fish I saw recently. Love cycling and cooking as well. So I'm excited to be on the podcast today.
We're very excited to have you, actually. And I think that last little segue there is kind of what I'd like to start as the first question, actually, because it's kind of although we'll be talking about AI today, it's a lot of the product that goes into it. It's really the human element behind it, which I think is maybe most interesting to a lot of people, certainly to me. So how do you ensure then that you have that sort of human-centric approach to product development as a whole, especially across a number of the different roles that you've had at LinkedIn there? I think that it probably comes up again and again, I should think.
It's a great question, and I think it actually helps to draw a parallel between what our jobs might have looked like 2 or 3 years ago versus what they look like now. When I think about products that were making headlines 2, 3 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, what was the common interface that everybody interacted with those products? It was using a mouse and clicking over different buttons, where if you think about it, folks like myself, product managers or the teams around the product managers, had so much control over what the user experience would be. And it was very easy to say, oh, okay, this user, we want them to go down this path, so let's design some flows and icons and colors that draw them in this way. When building with AI, you no longer have that sense of control, and you really are letting this, we use the phrase non-deterministic a lot at LinkedIn, because you basically relinquish control of what the products can do, because it's up to the user to interact with it, right? Like a great example is if you and I both opened our Facebook applications on our phone, your newsfeed and my newsfeed would look totally different. And that's based on the fact that we're interacting with it differently, and therefore everything is custom built to the user. So the way we think about human-centered design nowadays is a very challenging problem. And one sort of opinion that I have on this is that it has never been more important to be clear on your product principles than today. And there's a fantastic executive at LinkedIn named David Vombre, who works on our business development and partnerships team. And he has this really great way to think about principles as, think about all of the worst case scenarios and what you would need to do to avoid those happening, right? It's very similar to Charlie Munger's thinking by inversion principle, where you think about all the things that could go wrong and then build away from those from the beginning. A great example of this: if you're ever interacting with like a chat bot or chat type of service, like a chat GPT, we've all seen the headlines of the AI spitting out some nonsensical information sometimes even like hurtful or bigoted or basically malintended. And that's a very dangerous game because, of course, if we create a chatbot for Veriff together and there's the Veriff logo right there, and all of a sudden you have a chatbot hurling misinformation and who knows what, that's a terrible outcome, right? So one of our principles, our principle number one is what we call responsible AI, where we have an entire framework that we go through to battle test and verify that our AI is working as intended, and we have adequate safeguards in place to make sure that it's not abused or going awry. So we could have an entire podcast and discussion on like what are good principles for building AI products. But to answer your question directly, how do we ensure human-centered design? Number one, fundamentally get very crisp on your product principles, and number two, ensuring that you've done the adequate safeguarding to ensure that your AI systems are as aligned as you could possibly hope them to be.
Yeah, that's a good way of approaching it. I think we will get into some of those subjects later on, actually. But just for now, just to sort of dig into this a little bit more, because I'm interested to be sort of the kind of the how behind that process. I suppose I think those principles are great, but sort of bringing them into practice, I suppose, is the next step to that. So is that kind of based on kind of a feedback loop approach where when you're sort of refining the products and sort of constantly sort of improving things? And if so how do you bring those in when you're collaborating across a number of different teams that are involved in this process? I'm sort of thinking between, obviously you've got the UX design on one side, developers and various other stakeholders within your business that have more sort of commercial considerations possibly. So is the feedback loop the answer to that? And if so, sort of how do you sort of bring that into process and make sure that it's sort of constantly spinning the right way?
It's an interesting question, because one of my fundamental beliefs about technology products, and I'm sure many folks will disagree, which if you do, please connect with me on LinkedIn and tell me why. But I actually believe that no user actually cares about 90% of the technology products they use. Like with the exception of Instagram and TikTok and maybe some streaming services where you actually do derive some sort of delight and value from what you're consuming, I actually don't think anybody cares about the other 90% of products they use. Case in point, I'm a huge fan of this application called Dashlane, Dashlane, and it's a password manager. That's all it does. Not once in my life have I ever woken up in the morning and thought to myself, oh my God, I'm so excited that I get to use Dashlane. However, it's a product where every time I use it, I'm so in love with the objective that it solves and how it achieves that objective that it's one of my favorite products of all time, right? And I could say the same thing about Veriff, actually. Going through the verification flow maybe 2 or so months ago, I was in awe of how simple and easy to understand it was, where I could do it while multitasking a number of other things. So long-winded way of saying, I believe people don't care about products, they care about objectives. So how do you design a feedback loop around that objective, right? I would say that I'm in a very privileged position working in a place like LinkedIn, where we have a very talented group of designers and researchers and marketers whose job description is quite literally to be the voice of the user, the voice of the customer in our room. And I'll give you one example because I think it makes it more tangible. If you are a small business on LinkedIn, and you are focused on managing your employees, managing sales, making it to the next quarter, it's a tough process to be an entrepreneur and make it on your own. When you advertise on LinkedIn, all you want to do is launch the advertisement, get a lead, get a new customer in the door, and so we can spin the cycle. Around we go, right? And if you think about it, marketing can be a very complex ecosystem, lots of jargon, different products, a whole universe of technology that can help you accomplish your marketing objectives. And that can be very overwhelming for an entrepreneur who has to be running a business and then at the same time has to get smart on all these marketing topics, right? That's a very daunting ask. And we observed this at LinkedIn. And our hypothesis was, let's take the guesswork, the jargon, and all of the 100-odd decisions that go into having an idea for an advertisement and launching it on LinkedIn to, again, get customers in the door, get money in the bank, get food on the table. And so we launched this process called Accelerate, which maybe in the show notes I can add a press release from one of our vice presidents of product management. But the hypothesis was, we will ask an advertiser to just tell us what they're advertising with a little link to their website. We will then create an AI that goes to that website, reads it all, writes a huge product description of it, and then we'll seed a campaign with all of the attributes pre-filled. So if you're a small, medium-sized business and you just want to launch the ad, from their perspective, it's as simple as tell me what you're advertising and click launch. And what we're seeing, the product isn't perfect, right? But we're getting there. It's a step forward in the right direction. And we're learning a lot from early customers that have started to use it, engagement on the product. And what we're finding is that each of the individual constituent teams, mine being one of them, that participates in this large flow has different ways of seeking out and facilitating their own feedback cycle around the different pieces of the product itself. So there's that phrase, it takes a village, number one, and it certainly does, building a product like that. But getting very clear on what insight you are looking for, how you will track that insight, and how you will measure it ensures that once you do have users using it, all the people who are seeking specific feedback can start to acquire it and test those assumptions out on their own and then continue bringing the goodness back to the main product. So I hope that gets a little bit to your topic about feedback.
It certainly does. Yes. Yeah. And it leads in nicely to the next point, actually, is around the sort of the balancing considerations, I suppose, that you have as well when you're developing not only a new product, but an existing one and refining and sort of perfecting. I guess there's never an end line to this. It's always a continuous improvement cycle. But let's talk about that balance then. So how do you sort of balance the speed, the need for speed, the agility to sort of adjust, and also ethics? I think we mentioned that earlier on. Sort of like to bring that into the conversation here too. All the various elements that are in there then when it comes to sort of product development, how do you strike a balance?
The correct answer in my mind to this question starts with, as philosophical as this answer will be, and I apologize in advance, I think it actually starts with the fact that I believe incentives govern every decision, and humans are innately like self-centered beings, right? The first set of incentives I'm going to think about are the ones that affect me. The second set of incentives are the ones that affect other people, which will then affect me. The third set of incentives, then you can start to draw orbits around all of this. It's a really hard question, right? Like you mentioned a few things: speed, agility, ethics. I might include safety to that. I also might include delight, right? At the end of the day, no one wants to use a bad product to accomplish their objectives. And number one, getting very crisp on the incentives in the room when making some of these decisions, right? Like I'll give you an example. Let's say you and I are both working at a startup and we're trying to raise our next round of funding in 2 months, 3 months time. I'm probably incentivized, as you and I both are, to ship new iterations of the product, new features. So we look busy and we create this aura, this sense of momentum that then incentivizes venture capitalists or other investors to say, "Oh, you better get in now because we're going to hit something big in a year," right? Like that's one universe of incentives. A different incentive might be, I'm at a very mature, very large scale company where making a 0.5% of change might mean hundreds of millions of dollars of impact, right? In that case, maybe it makes more sense to be more measured, measure twice, cut once, don't move fast and break things, because the incentives are such that doing so has a really, really big cost to them. So the first thing that I think is important in any of these product decisions, it's like the product manager needs to do this, the engineering manager needs to do this, the marketer needs to do this, is get very crisp on like, what are the incentives governing this decision? And then it comes back to the principles, which is a theme I'll keep coming back to, right? Because your principles will exist regardless of the product that you're building. And our head of product, Tomer Cohen, has referenced principles as the method in which you will make a decision, right? It's almost like a pre-flight checklist. Does this meet responsible AI? Does this earn the trust of our members? Is this a simple design? Like all of these attributes that ensure that the product you're shipping is of quality. So every product manager has their own secret sauce for what is the prioritized set of principles that matter to them. My top two are safety and responsible AI. And then it changes depending on the product we're talking about. But the way you instrument those principles can change either way, right? Let's take an example of like safety. My team is what they call like a platform product team. So we build technologies that are shared by other developers and teams to build their experiences, right? So in a real world example, my team builds hammers, your team uses hammers to build your house. Something that we have to do rigorously anytime we ship a change is make sure we test the entire flow, every pixel from 2 standard deviations before and 2 standard deviations down. Why? Because if we change something and other teams are dependent on our work, we might accidentally break other products that we might not even know about, right? And I'm in the context of LinkedIn. Let's say I was working at a company such as Amazon or Stripe that powers the modern internet and global digital commerce. If Stripe all of a sudden made a change that said it could no longer stop accepting euros, that might literally blow up an economy overnight. And so when we think about this principle of safety and trust and responsible AI, how do you make that happen? Well, it's by doing all of the grunt work that is not sexy, that doesn't get reported on, that no one claps for you when you do, that ensure that your product is of value and your principle has been upheld, right? And you can have other examples of this on more soft or nebulous principles like delightful design, right? Where if it's in the aura of your company to make people enjoy the experience, you might want to compare the product you are building to previous research briefs that you have, or put it in front of customers to see how it makes them feel. But really the goal of how to make any of this actionable is that once you've built the product, before you release it, to make sure that it is tested and measured against the people who are going to judge it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we sort of see the same thing, certainly at Veriff as well, actually. It's a product that exists in the background of our, for our customers, essentially, for our customers to make sure that their customers are having those delightful experiences, as you say. And you kind of alluded to it earlier on, actually, where not everybody wants to hang out with their financial services provider or their, socially at least, or spend, interact with them in that way. They just want it to work, and they just want it to be something that is as unobtrusive as possible and sort of just exists kind of behind the scenes there, but that provides that reassurance that things are working and things are doing as they are supposed to do, which is, ultimately the end goal of any I would argue. But just steering it a little into sort of, again, sort of talking a little bit more about the AI specifically. So AI frameworks, I think, are something that are called out quite a lot when we're talking with our experts at this end here about how they organize work and so on, and certainly ensure like the ethical side of AI development. Is that something that you would be familiar with from your work as well? And do you have any examples that you could drop in or guidelines that you could share with us as people that be interested in that?
I'll start off by one quick comment, which is that AI is not always the right answer. There are some instances where you need very specific, determinist, controlled, rules-based technologies. Great example of this is, as much as I want Amazon to know what I buy, when I buy it, how much I buy it, I do not want Amazon making purchasing decisions on my behalf, right? That's an instance where I would always prefer you ask me before I get a charge on my credit card, right? Now, with that in mind, let's talk about frameworks. And I think implicitly there is a note in here of like literature on the space, right? I'm of the belief that it is a fundamental need for people building an AI right now to be looking to get inspiration from other companies and to be learning from the academics and scholars in the room. The reason for that is because we are no longer in a place where you can get by building products the same way that they had been built for the last 10 years. A great example of this. My team was building a number of customer service chatbots. 2 years ago, if you had fired up one of those on LinkedIn, it would greet you in the same way that you might use a customer service experience on a phone, right? You self-triage by saying, oh, press 2, then press 3, then press 4, based on the prompts that someone gives to you. In came GPT. And we wanted to integrate GPT with the experience. And what we did was we took this hybrid approach of a somewhat decision tree oriented approach and started just baking in pieces of AI to write the words in a way that you might resonate with a little bit more, to answer your question a little bit more directly. And as soon as we'd gotten through the lion's share of that work, a new AI technology sprung up and rendered everything we were building useless. And so we all of a sudden have to scrap it and start over from the beginning. And so how did we know that that was coming? Because there were AI papers written by scholars and academics on this topic, written on this topic months prior. And so I think it's been a really fascinating time to be building in technology, because you basically have to become a student again, right? Like the thought leaders I'm looking at have .edu email addresses, not .com addresses. And so that's been a huge source of opportunity and leverage for my teams, for everyone to stay well-versed on the news and what's going on. And a really good example of this, right? I think Google is in a very interesting position. And when history books write about Google, I promise 2024 will come up, because you can totally understand. I'm referencing their issues with the Gemini model, by the way, and misattributing facts, right? And I was reading this interesting thread recently where it's like, if people rely on language models to provide learning or insights from them, and they have the possibility to misconstrue previous events or misconstrue facts, we might be in a situation where ethically AI models are by design misrepresenting history that we all learn and becomes the new history. And we might be forgetting on tens of thousands, generations and generations of lived experiences that are getting, just by virtue of the math of AI, getting jumbled up along the way. And that's a very scary problem. So when I think about Google right now, I think they have so much talent. They have such a great opportunity. They have such a deep footprint in businesses and personal lives and individuals that the way they navigate the next year, that might even be too long, maybe the next few months, is really going to set a precedent, I think, for how other companies build AI, think about AI, research AI, safeguard around AI, protect the integrity of some of our social systems that we all really depend on at probably as like a fundamental level as like our healthcare as an example. But you can't blame the intention, right? And so that's one thing where I think it's almost like watching the World Cup in technology right now, because you have everyone trying to get it right. You have everyone trying to get it right. And some people, they're going to get it wrong. And if they're big enough, getting it wrong is like a big problem. And so, we're watching the news, we're taking inspiration from other people. Members on my team are reaching out to different startups and industry competitors to say, oh, how'd you crack that problem? We're thinking about this. What do you think? And it's been a much more collaborative time, paying attention to the academics, reading the news, and learning from other people's examples. I think are three ways that we're learning from different AI frameworks and best practices. And of course, as the ethics come into play, they're becoming parts of our discussions as well.
Well, I alluded to it there. I think it's this sort of law of unintended consequences to a certain extent of possibly problems creeping into the system and so on. But what about just flipping that on its head a little bit? What about people who look to misuse this technology for sort of ill-gotten gains, as it were? We sort of see this at Veriff a lot, obviously in the fraud prevention space, where there's almost, it feels like an arms race between just as quickly as we can build defenses, there's people out there who are looking to utilize this technology for fraudulent gain, effectively. Let's talk a little bit about sort of the evolving sort of threats there, I suppose, and what role do you think innovation has in combating this type of fraud?
It's one of the most terrifying changes that I think AI will bring about. I remember 6 months ago listening to a bit of news where a few elderly individuals were getting scammed out of their retirement savings because an AI system basically adopted the voice of one of their grandchildren and got them into a state of stress to the point where the grandparent ended up sending their retirements and livelihood and financial means to what they thought would save their grandchild from the issue that they were in. And technically, that's not a hard thing to do, right? Like I actually don't think it takes a genius to misuse a lot of this technology and really just slip under people's radar and cause adverse harm, which is really scary. And that's where I think companies like Veriff and Clear are doing some great work in this way to make sure that the internet can remain a safe and trustworthy place, more so than ever. LinkedIn recently was voted the most trusted social network on the internet. And we've had a really big motion around verifying identity. Actually, that individual I mentioned earlier, David Vombre, is sort of been at the helm of this. But it's a really tough problem, right? Because you need to be able to trust the other person on the side of a transaction, the other person you're speaking to, the company you're speaking to, for you to realize or accomplish any of the objectives that we talked about earlier, right? I mean, tangibly speaking, I bought a car last year and it was an electric vehicle. My entire transaction process was online. I didn't speak to a single individual until I showed up to pick up the vehicle, right? And it was pre this sort of AI boom in the way that is now, where when I signed onto the website, like I could trust that was that website. But I think quickly we will get into a situation where that might not be the case, where the services we know and love might be more prone to fraudsters and scammers and that type of thing. And it is a problem that is here already and surely in need of innovation. So it will require lots of really talented people to solve this problem. And I think there's some interesting developments here, verifications online being one of them, online credentialing being another. Say what you will about the crypto economy, but I think there is a nugget of value to be had in sort of the immutability and trustworthiness of a lot of blockchain protocols that we can draw inspiration from. So I'll be interested to see how the story pans out.
I think too is one of the things we're finding certainly is that the fraudulent aspect to lots of online interactions these days is actually prompting end users or customers or whatever platform users in the case of LinkedIn possibly to be a lot more vigilant themselves and be a lot more demanding of the services that they're using. So it's almost that they sort of demand a sort of a certain level of robustness that for the sign up process or the re-sign in process, whatever it may be. They're prepared to accept a little bit of friction if it means that there's going to be more safety that comes with it. Is that something that you're finding in your line too, with the sort of the social platform space?
I mean, absolutely. Anytime you want a user to do something, they need to be convinced that there is something of value on the other side of that transaction. That's even true of something I'm thinking about right now. A financial services company that I use quite a bit is called Wealthfront. And they're doing a really interesting referral process right now where I'm basically thinking about, do I want to go out of my way to tell the next person, hey, you should open up this savings account because it's really great and here's the interest rate you're going to get. But that's an arduous process for them to go through and open a new financial services account. It's a very intimate decision as well. However, the referral bonuses are quite large. So it's this balance that you have to think about. But when you pan out and think about what's really going on, what we're trying to do is create some proof of trust. That's what these verifications are doing. And there have been many examples in history where this has happened before, right? Like let's take Venmo as an example, PayPal's peer-to-peer money movement solution. What person in their right mind thought adding a news feed of other people's transactions was going to be interesting to me? But that's the first page I open on Venmo, right? Now, what's interesting is that actually wasn't meant for the purpose that I thought it was. What it was meant to do was to provide some social proof that this is a tool that you can trust because your friends are using it too. And so there are lots of ways to triangulate this, and I think it's very much an art, not so much a science to do. But I think the more likely outcome is that we're going to see something of like a spectrum of trust, where you have companies like Veriff on the extreme side of the spectrum, which is to say, hey, you've given me your identity. I've gone and jumped through all the hoops and done the technological gymnastics to verify that Chris is Chris. On the other side of the spectrum, you have totally Wild West. You have no idea what's going on, right? It's purely anonymous, can't verify anything. And along the way, you're going to have bits of social proof, bits of maybe like a Veriff light experience where you can infer someone's trustworthiness or legitimacy. And I think it'll depend on what the job of the company is that is going to use it, right? Like, for example, Reddit might not ever really need a crazy robust solution because anonymity is kind of in the nature of using that tool, versus something like a LinkedIn, for example, is incredibly needed because you are applying to jobs. Part of applying to jobs is referencing a social security number if you end up getting hired. Like, these are very intimate things. So long-winded way of saying, I expect that depending on the objective of the company or the product that you're solving, it will require some level of trust investment. And that is going to be sort of the tough job of the CEOs or head of risk or head of product, is to think about, okay, well, how much trust is enough trust?
Yeah, it's a very good way of summarizing, I think. And just to wrap up, we've got just a few minutes left here. Then I always sort of ask this as the final question and sort of get a chance for you to get your crystal ball out. But what if you were to make some predictions about, in fact, you've already made some actually for you think the course of this year might unfold, but what would you say that would be the things to look out for in this space? I mean, certainly around LinkedIn and the sort of the various products that they're developing there, but also in the wider sort of AI space too. What would you say would be the things that people need to look out for?
Let's go predictions that I am most certain of to the ones that I am least certain of. The first and foremost is I think identity is going to become digital first. It's crazy to me that in 2024, I still frantically check my back pocket to make sure my passport is in my pocket when I'm traveling internationally, or that I will be driving to the supermarket and halfway through turn back around to drive back to my house to get the little plastic card that says I took the test and know how to operate the vehicle. Moreover, when you have digital verifications, like you might not even need a device on you, right? An officer could pull you over and you could say, hey, my number is 123 ABC, and they can verify it themselves, right? So I think digital is the primary medium where identity and trust is going to come from. That's prediction one. Prediction two, I think, and this is kind of getting more at the AI piece, I think the way we think about education is going to really change from schools as this bundled group of services of credentialing agencies, upskilling people, almost like a signaling to your community that I'm an educated person or otherwise. I think all of that is going to change because the most fundamental job of an education institution is to teach you something, and it has never been easier to learn anything at your own speed in your own way now that we have a lot of these tools. So I expect the way we think about education, and you can think of all the second order consequences of the education systems being changed and like how that affects countries, communities, social welfare, everything. I think that's really, really going to change. Third is, while as a spectator, I'm very excited to see the AI arms race, or so it's called, of Anthropic launches Claude 3, OpenAI is touting GPT-5, like all these model makers are touting sort of the next best thing. And I think there's an interesting pattern emerging where you basically have cloud providers investing huge swaths of money into these model makers, where eventually I think we're going to get to a point where some of these models are just good enough as is. Like there's not, all I need is a Toyota Camry to get me to the grocery store. I don't need a Lamborghini, even if a Lamborghini exists, or it might be fun to drive. And I think eventually, after some of this hype and excitement dies down, we're going to start to see a model where companies basically just look at the set of models available to them via whatever their cloud provider is and use the one that makes sense for them, rather than always trying to keep up with the Joneses, if you will, and jump from thing to thing. So I'm not as keen on the long-term sort of like awe factor of these model makers in the way that I am more seeing the market dynamics of it all playing out. That's medium certainty. And then last one is, let's talk about digital doubles for a second. If you connect with me on LinkedIn, you will quickly see my activity on LinkedIn as talking a lot about like AIs and models and infrastructure and LangChain and a bunch of these different topics. I absolutely believe, or rather I hope, that our future 20 years from now looks like Chris has a copy of himself digitally that is just responsible for work automation, where it knows how you write, it knows how you speak, and you basically have a digital assistant that comes to you and says, hey, Chris, my friend Lottie just asked me a question. Here's the question. What would you like to say? And you just speak to your AI and the AI writes it for you. Or when someone reaches out to me on LinkedIn to talk about career stuff, I can instead give them the like Zane bot to talk to that has all my intelligence that they can query against and so on and so forth. So basically a situation where every human has, I don't want to say an army because that connotes some sort of catastrophe or like, struggle, but like where every human has basically just like a set of machines working for it to make us all more efficient and accomplish what we want to do. And I don't think we're that far off either, by the way. So that would be the one that I'm most keen on, where it's like the Zane bot talks to the Chris bot, talks to the Lottie bot. The three of them come up with something to do. And then they're like, hey, Chris, Lottie, Zane, we recommend this. What do you guys think? And the three of us just go, yep, sounds good. Launch it, invite, so on and so forth. So it should be an interesting next decade, to say the least.
I love that. I was going to say it would be good for us to check in a year's time to see how those predictions are going, but it may be my bot talking to your bot on the next podcast that we do together.
That's right. Yep, here's hoping.
All right, so thanks very much. I know we've about out of time, but this has been really, really insightful as always. And as I say, first of all, thank everybody for listening, but also thank you for joining us as well, Zane.
Likewise, pleasure's all mine. Thanks for having me on the podcast. And for those listening, please do Chris and I the favor and share any insights you come across as the story evolves. We'll be better for it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.
This podcast is brought to you by Veriff. Identity verification made simple. Learn more at veriff.com.